The following is a Hoop Ball presentation.
Hello, and welcome to the Hoop Ball DFS Today podcast. I am your host, Mike Apotria, joined by my good buddy today, and we're gonna give him a chance to reintroduce himself because it's been a while, and it's been a while for all of us. My good buddy David Menkov. David, how are you? How is New York City looking?
Hey, Mike, doing well. Just trying to survive this tough time we're all dealing with. New York City is certainly quite a shell of what it used to be, for sure. So excited to get back up and running in the near future.
Yeah, and I'm not too far from you. I'm right over here in Connecticut, so stone's throw. You guys obviously at the forefront of pretty much everything that's been going on as of late. So I know everybody over here. Hoop Ball wishes you the best, and we wish New York City the best. And if there's one state that can bounce back from tremendous adversity, it is the great state of New York City, and we've seen that time and time again. So. Nothing but the best over here from me, and I know that we'll end up getting through this. And the one thing that is the light at the end of the tunnel is it looks like sports is on the horizon. We're slowly starting to see them trickle in, and as that happens, man, we find ourselves back talking about them, and that's the piece to all this. So. I wanted to reintroduce you because you did start, and begin doing shows for us over here at Hoop Ball. Probably about 1 week, the week before everything kicked off with the COVID-19, and people got to hear you, got to meet you, but I don't feel like it was justice, man. So why don't you tell everybody a little bit more about yourself, how you kind of got started over here at Hoop Ball, how you got started at DFS, and maybe a couple just fun facts that we can use to get to know you.
Absolutely. I appreciate that. So I'd say in terms of Hoop Ball, I've definitely been an avid listener of the Hoop Ball kind of startup kind of vibe, and kind of just working on trying to understand, and really big fan of the whole operation over at Hoop Ball, and really been a fan for a few years now. And in terms of from a daily fantasy perspective, something that I've definitely been a huge fan of and been a big part of my life day to day for the past few years as well. So it's something that I've always been intrigued at. It's something that I really enjoyed learning about, and that's kind of why I really wanted to jump in and kind of talk through kind of my strategies and kind of how I look at just lineups in general. And then from a fun fact perspective, I would say for me it would be just being able to just to touch upon kind of the fact that I am a Philadelphia 76ers fan. Even though living in New York, it's kind of a dangerous proposition being a Sixers fan. So it's certainly something that definitely gets some backlash for sure.
I think we around here in Connecticut, what we generally would call somebody living in New York not being a Knicks fan is smart. I may take some heat for that one, but I think most Knicks fans at this point, and maybe the past few years, might agree with me that you almost have to be clinically insane to be a Knicks/Jets fan. Over the past few years. So I'm just joking. I pretty much live in Connecticut. Our televised games, I was getting the Knicks. So during the rough times, man, I was watching probably about 25 to 40 games of Alexei Shved per season. And I was loving every second of it. But well, we're glad to have you, man. I'm glad to be able to finally be doing a show with you. I was hearing great things, talking with Andrew about you, talking with Dan. So shout out Dan Bespus over there. Being one of the man behind the curtain, kind of weaving all this beautifulness together. But we're going to jump right into it, man. We're going to be talking some. So last time I was on, Andrew and I were talking some simulation strategy when that first started to kick off to give everybody some entertainment during this, time at home. But with sports right on the horizon, we're going to just kind of go back through Talk about some strategy, based contests, like whether it's cash game strategy, tournament strategy, some things to look forward to, just to kind of get us back in the swing of things, get the gears moving in the brain again. And then we're going to start breaking down some notable teams. Hopefully by then we have a better idea of what teams and what kind of season we'll be looking at once we return. But we're going to start with the teams that we at least know will be in the big picture regardless, as long as there is a playoff scenario, how they're going to be looking. Maybe some notable things to keep an eye on that we've heard through over the past few weeks, that's going to impact the DFS landscape. So we'll jump right into things, brother. So we're just going to start off. What are the main difference between a cash game and the GPP? Why don't you just run that over real quick, just quickly? For the people that are listening, who maybe we have all different groups of listeners over here for our DFS platform, whether they're veterans, whether they're new. Just a quick definition that you'd say, cash versus GPP.
Absolutely. So appreciate that. So in terms of, I would say from a cash versus GPP perspective, the main difference I look at when creating lineups and kind of dissecting kind of strategies for the weekly lineups and daily lineups would be the fact that just in cash games itself, the prize pool is typically the top 50% of the entries typically cash out versus the bottom 50. So typically that's a huge factor in kind of how you're building your lineups. You want to be in that top 50% in order to cash. Versus those GPP tournaments, you're looking at a much larger scale amount of just entries and potential lineups variations. And typically it's very much top heavy from a payout standpoint. And that certainly adds a different level of volatility to the kind of strategy and overall lineup builds.
I think that was picture perfect, and that was going to segue pretty much into the next topic of I wanted to speak on is the kind of contest that we're going to be choosing and the differences between those contests. So you said it perfectly. Mainly for cash, the contests that we're going to be looking at are your 50-50s, your heads-up contests, the ones where you only need to finish in the top 50 percentile in order to win. Obviously, if it's a heads-up, it's you're finishing 1 out of 2. And if it's a 50-50 contest with 100 people in that contest, you would need to finish in the top 50, top 50 percentile. So it'd be top 50 or above to cash out, double your money pretty much. Obviously, most sites will take a rake. Not counting that rake, it would be doubling your money. So that's perfect definition for it. I love it. And what that means to me, and what everybody else should be looking at this for, is if you're playing in one of these cash game contests, it doesn't matter if, let's say I said there's 100 people in the contest, if you finish 49th or if you finish first, you're winning the same amount of money. And that's something that you take into an account when you're constructing these lineups, as opposed to our tournaments, we're really trying to finish in that top, realistically top, 10, 15 percentile pays out. But we're not playing in a tournament to pay out minimum, because then if that's the case, we'd only be paying cash or double ups. What we're really doing is to try to finish in that top 1 percentile. And to do that, you need to take into a lot of other factors, including prices, including ownerships, including, ceilings, floors, and all those things. And we're going to touch on those things and the difference in what we look at for a cash and GPP. So I don't know if there's anything else you wanted to kind of add as far as the contest, but mostly if I'm playing cash game, I generate more towards the 50-50s. And if you're playing, bigger money, I kind of find myself gravitating towards the heads up, because I'd rather just, play somebody one-on-one for a little bit more money. And then I'll spread my 50-50s out. But let's touch on some bankroll management as far as this before we just jump into the nitty gritty as far as ownership and all the other fancy terminology that we use. What would you recommend as far as bankroll management when you're looking at cash versus GPP? And we'll say we have the bankroll of, I have $100 in my DraftKings account right now.
Yeah, that's a great question. So if you have $100 in your account, I would say on a nightly basis, from a bankroll perspective, I think it really depends on kind of what kind of DFS player are you trying to become. So I think that's number one factor in determining kind of where you're going to go with that bankroll. So if you're looking to kind of have a more, I would say a more managed kind of expectation level, and somehow be able to kind of test your knowledge and strategies in an environment where you can potentially finish in the top 50%, versus really going after and going all in on some of those large UV tournaments. I think from a bankroll perspective, you want to definitely dip in a little bit in the tournament pools, with those larger scale tournament actions. Typically, those millionaire makers, those are worth throwing some of your bankroll into. But I would say if you have $100 and you want to have a fairly solid baseline for success, I would say definitely look at more 50-50s, kind of head-to-head kind of style games.
Yes, and that's exactly pretty much what I was, putting it on the tee for you for, and you successfully hit it right off the tee. It's but mostly for when bankroll management, when it comes down to it, we're using a lot of these 50-50s to cover ourselves. If you're a heavy tournament player, and I think Dave kind of lumps himself in the same category, and I consider myself more of a GPP type player, and people that are listening probably know this by now. But that doesn't mean I necessarily don't play cash games. If you have $100 bankroll, what I'm going to recommend and what I generally play, let's say if I had $100 in my DraftKings account, is I'm never playing more than 20% of my entire allotment. So I would play $20 at most in a night if I have $100 in there. And now I have to allocate that. How much is that going towards cash, and how much is that going towards GPP? Well, we're pretty much, if you're successful, and you touched on it, what kind of DFS player do you want to be? When I first started, I was the type of player that I wanted to play with house money. So I used, specifically 50-50s and double ups to earn myself a bankroll. And then once I had an allotted bankroll that I was playing with some house money, I started entering in a few contests here and there, testing my skills, building some GPP lineups. And eventually the bankroll got larger. But I was always playing about, 20% of my bankroll. And when it's early on and you don't have a big bankroll to play with, I would allocate at least 75% of that towards your cash games. And as that starts to kind of build up and you have some money to play with, you can go maybe a little bit 50-50 if you want to play some cash, some tournament, and then even if you want to go a little less. But I would always make sure I have more money in my, at least equal or more money in my cash game to cover my losses on those tournament nights, because there's a lot of times where your tournament line could easily crush in a cash game, and in other times where your tournament line would have finished in the absolute bottom. That's the point of a tournament. There's a lot of up and down. There's a lot of risk reward. You're really playing for that top number one spot, and that's going to take us into why we construct, how we construct, and the differences between constructing our cash and tournament lineup. So. The number one thing I always factor in, and I have with a big circle and a big star going around it right now, is ownership, Dave. So I'm gonna put it on the tee for you, and I know this is a big touch point when it comes to our cash games. And what's the difference between ownership and looking at ownership in cash versus tournament?
Absolutely. So I would say, again, the first variable in that would be kind of the size of your slate. So if we're looking at a 4-game slate, let's say, versus like a 10 or 11, one of those monster game slates that we like to really project. So if you're looking at, let's say, one of those monster slates, typically when you're looking at cash games, you're looking at ownership potentially that's going to be at least around 50 and 20% per player, I would say, for cash games. In order to look at cashing in the top 50%, that's what you're kind of aiming for. When you have those smaller slates, those percentages tend to increase significantly to around 30 to 40%, depending on the type of slate as well. So I would say that's a main difference versus a GPP lineup, where you're expecting to throw in a few dart throws, to say the least, that are typically low owned in that 5-10% range to really differentiate your lineup. So I would say that those are kind of the differentiating kind of percentages that you want to look for when you're building your bankroll lineups.
No, that's absolutely perfect. And when we look at these ownerships, and when you're constructing and you're thinking about ownership, you're really thinking about it a lot more in a GPP necessarily as a cash. When I'm building my cash lineups, I think about ownership sometimes. I'll think about a pivot here and there, but I'm really less concerned because I'm not trying to separate myself from the pack as much. I'm just trying to construct what I think can be, a fairly high scoring lineup. I'm not worried about finishing first again, or I'm not worried about finishing 49th. I will pay out the exact same. So, you'll hear the term thrown around in DFS pretty often, and it's called chalk. And you'll hear a lot of people that play tournaments trying to fade the chalk, trying to avoid the chalk, trying to pivot from the chalk. Whereas in cash, we'll eat that chalk more often than not because if we're not necessarily looking for much more than him just hitting his value, and if he has that upside, fantastic. But the bare minimum is hitting that floor and hitting the ceilings and making sure that we're getting what we're paying for. So that's kind of it as far as ownership. The percentages that you mentioned, 5% ownership. That's exactly the type of guy that we're looking for in one of those GPPs. A guy that's finishing well above where he's projected to at like a 5, or even sometimes you see 2, 3, 4% ownerships. Because that's differentiating yourself. That's separating yourself from the pack. Those are the types of plays that will get you finishing first, second, or third, as opposed to the guys who are 60, 70% ownership and then bust, and then all of a sudden you're looking forward to that next night pretty quickly. So I'll transition right into those floors and ceilings that I just mentioned because that's one thing I take into account. Awfully a lot when I'm looking into building my cash, my tournament lineups, and it's simply because you don't need to be as risk adverse as in cash as opposed to your tournament. So why don't you touch on some of the things as far as floors and ceilings when obviously you get a guy that has two players can be priced at the same price. They both can be about, let's say, 6,000 on DK, but they might be 6,000 for two different reasons. So how do the floors and the ceiling of a player affect whether or not he has the opportunity to make your cash game lineup?
That's a great point. And Mike, you really mentioned the fact that it's essential for cash games to really look at that floor when you're really building your lineups. You really want to look at guys that have a pretty high floor that you're looking for. You're not really chasing that really high ceiling as much. You're chasing that high floor kind of player. And when you're building your lineups, if you can build your whole lineup out of high floor players, they're typically more likely to hit value, and you're more likely again to finish in that top 50%. So that would be kind of the way I would look at cash games in constructing lineups. And it's important to really look at kind of the players themselves, and as you start to develop and understand kind of the players, and kind of you look at kind of their game logs. That's a great way to determine what is that floor they have potential for, and that's really going to go a long way in understanding where that player is, and if he's $6,000 versus another player that's 6,000, that's going to be a factor in putting that lineup together for cash builds versus GPPs.
Yeah, and that's pretty much exactly what I was hinting towards. It's that not everybody's price is created equally. One player that could be $6,000 could, be averaging, let's say, 30 DK points, and the other player could be $6,000 averaging 30 DK points. But player A has 4 games, 5 games of 45 or plus more DK points, but 4 or 5 games as low as 14 or 15 DK points, while the other person could just be steady 25 as a floor with the ceiling of 35. So you're not necessarily going to have that sort of ceiling or upside of getting the 50 or 30 or 45 point games out of player B, but we know you're getting that security blanket of that he's not going to burn you. You're getting 25 at the very least, and you have the upside of 30 to 35, and that's exactly what you're looking for in the cash games: is a nice high, safe, secure floor with some upside for a little bit more. And those are just some pretty generic examples of player A versus player B, but with that kind of notion and with that kind of mindset of what could this guy do for me and how could he hurt me at the same time is extremely important when I'm constructing, because like I said, I'm trying to be risk adverse in my cash. I want to feel comfortable. I want to know that this is the only lineup I'm making, and I'm putting it all up for every single lineup. It could be my $100 or $200 worth of cash value that night, and I'm making one lineup for it. So you don't want to necessarily be risk adverse or as risk. You want to be risk adverse. So we're talking about, if a guy's 6K and he's averaging 30 points. That kind of brings us right into our next point, Dave, and it's going to be, the 5X rule. And a lot of people use it, and I said we'd get into some terminology, and this is probably one of the most common terminology phrases used in DFS, and it's, 4X, 5X, 6X, all the way up to 8, 10X, and what that means. So if you have a quick minute, why don't you just let people know, if they don't already, what the, I guess, 5X rule is for a guy that would be 6K.
Absolutely. So for a guy that's 6K, in order to kind of hit that 5X, you're going to be looking at it from just a points perspective. So a 5X guy would typically get somewhere in the 35-point range, and that's kind of the floor for a 5X player versus a 4X player. So typically, when we're looking at cash games, if we're looking at it from that perspective, we're looking at guys that are more likely to hit that 4 or 5X number versus get that 8 to 10X. And I'm not saying that it's not possible that they're going to get to the 8 and 10X really absolute, being able to exceed value tremendously. But I think they're more prone to the more of those 4X, 5X type of outputs in that 35 to 40 point range. Versus going for those big 60-point numbers that you could potentially see from a $6,000 player.
Yeah, and it really just comes down to, from the standpoint of what the guy's salary is, what his price tag is, to determine what what 5X is for them. So 5X is going to be different for all different prices, obviously. So if a guy is $5,000, he costs $5,000 on DK. 5X would simply just be his price tag times 5, and that would be about 25 fantasy points. So we're banking on this guy getting at least 25 fantasy points. If you don't feel confident that he can get 25 fantasy points in that night on DK, that's the type of night where you say, hey, this guy's probably not a cash game. I don't feel 60 to 75, 80% sure that he's going to get me that 25 fantasy points. Where a guy that is, for another example, 10K. 5X would be 50 fantasy points. So, obviously the higher the price tag is, the closer they're going to be to 5X. You're not expecting a guy that costs 10K to give you 8X every night, like in a tournament, as opposed to a guy that costs you, 6K. You really want him to have the upside of 8X in a tournament. 5X is exactly what we're looking for, regardless of the price tag, whether it's a 10K guy, whether it's a 5K guy. Obviously, the more the merrier. We want to just, go for a little bit upside. We don't want to just fill our lineups with a bunch of Thaddeus Youngs. But we want to make sure that we have that nice, safe floor. And a 5X mark is generally the consensus mark for cash games. You'll hear people say anywhere between 4 and 6 is what you're shooting for. But if, I usually just say in my head, if he can't get 5, I don't think he can get me 5, at least 5X. I'm not considering for cash. I'll take the chance on a guy like that in tournaments, because if I don't feel confident in him get me 5X, I might feel confident that he has the upside to get more, just not the confidence that he has the floor to get that 5X. So, that's pretty much what I wanted to just go over real quick as far as the quick 5X rule. I know a lot of people always ask, what does that necessarily mean? How do we apply that? And that's exactly how we do it generally over here, and I'm sure just about everywhere for DFS in this landscape. But one other key rule and key factor that I always think of, and I think is very, very important as far as cash game play, and this goes for tournament play. But if some of the things that we see that make a guy so chalky, that make him such a good cash game play, that stand out right away, and it's simply minutes equal money. It's something that we've been saying over here, at Hoop Ball for quite some time. And, if a guy's getting the minutes, he's getting the opportunity. And those are two of the things that you need to be successful in DFS. We talk about points per minute. We talk about everything as far as that goes. But you need to be on the court. And, being on the court obviously gives you that higher ceiling. So, what are some other things that, you could think of, that are nice little tidbits for our listeners that they can use, that minutes equal money, for these chalkier plays? What makes a guy chalky, I guess, is another way you could say it, a chalky cash game play?
Yeah, that's a great first nugget. I would definitely agree with that. I think that's number one kind of starting rule for any of those kind of chalky plays when you're looking at cash games. I think another one that I can't stress enough is looking at matchups. So matchups. At any given slate, there are certain matchups you really want to take advantage of, and you know that the team playing that team is going to be a great matchup from a DFS perspective. They don't play a lot of defense. They don't play a lot of man-to-man defense or any kind of team defense. And you know that there's a potential, as long as that player plays minutes, as like you mentioned, there's a good chance they're going to put up that 5x number. So I think that's something you really want to look for on any given slate. Always find those matchups to really build your lineups around when you're looking at cash games.
That's a great tip. And I mean, we can even spend a couple minutes real fast just talking about a couple of those teams that, pre-COVID, I guess we could say, we were looking at as those chalky matchups. And, I couldn't have, that's a perfect example because, I'm thinking Hawks, I'm thinking Wizards, Timberwolves. Pelicans, four teams that just pop right into my head where as soon as I see them on the schedule, I look at who's facing them. There's some prototypical, those are four teams we know play pretty well up in pace, where it's going to be pretty high scoring. And we also know those are going to be two teams where, they bleed points. They play, or four teams that play little to no defense. So most people, like you said, are going to gravitate towards those guys, and they're going to be considered chalky. And, we may take some secondary options instead of the primary options in our tournaments. But in cash games, we can be as chalky as we'd like. We can load up on these games. And, that brings us into probably another little fun thing that we can keep in mind and just talk about real fast. And it's very, very, I guess, similar to, matchups. And it's just, player matchups. There's some teams that, maybe they're not necessarily the fastest paced team, or they don't have the worst, defense, but they might struggle at one position specifically. And you'll hear me say this often with the teams like the Kings. The Kings, they play pretty decent defense all around, but they struggle mightily against shooting guards. So a shooting guard going into Sacramento can tend to be pretty chalky on any given night. But another thing that I'm not generally worried about as much in my cash games as opposed to my GPPs, and it just circles back to ownership. We're not worried about the ownership as much in these cash games, so we will eat that sort of chalk, regardless if it's a team matchup, a pace kind of matchup, if it's just a defense versus position sort of matchup. We're willing to kind of eat all of that good stuff up, my friend. Well, that's pretty much it, I guess, really, for our cash game. Just a little run through, basic things that separate it, the differences between GPP, some of the strategies that we use when we're kind of constructing these. Obviously, it's a little bit more difficult to talk about when we don't have prices right in front of you. And, we're always willing to kind of field these questions if anybody has any, but why don't we take a quick second? We'll just give a quick shout out to presenting sponsors, Hawaiian Isles Kona Coffee. Absolutely love these guys. You'll hear me mention them, tried and true, every single morning. It's basically how I start my morning, is with a cup of Hawaiian Isles Kona Coffee. So you get your fancy gold clip, you get the grinds. I use a Keurig, Dave. I don't know. That should have been the first question I started this podcast off with. Are you a coffee guy?
I'm a huge coffee guy.
All right. Well, I knew. I told Dan from now on, like, if we're gonna bring people on, they got to have the good cup of Joe. It's my sanity check. I don't know. I got to know who I'm working with over here. And you get those people that are like, I don't drink coffee, and I'm like, okay. So what? You're better than us? I don't get it. What are you trying to prove here? So, but no, seriously, guys, check out Hawaiian Isles Kona Coffee. You can check them out on Amazon. Go to hawaiianisles.com. Just multitudes, light roast, dark roast, whatever you're feeling. They're fantastic. Check them out. And when you have a chance, give us a follow on Twitter. You can find me at Mike Apotria. It's MikeApotria. You can find David at DMenk33. Dave, do I have that correct?
That is correct.
Why don't you spell that for the good people?
DMenk, it's DMENK 33.
Absolutely. And we'll give a quick second just to shout out our good buddy over here at Hoopball, who just had a new little child brought into this world. So, big shout out to Devin Ellington. I'm struggling to say that. Devin Ellington, bringing a new child into this world. Congratulations to him and his family over there. We wish you guys nothing but the best, and we are very happy to have you proud of this hoopball community. For those who don't know, Devin has been one of the forefront members of our hoopball gaming, absolutely crushing it. And I just wanted to take a second to kind of throw it over there. So if you guys have a minute, give him a quick shout out on Twitter. Tell him congratulations, and I'll be appreciative because it's always nice getting a little bit of love from everybody, especially when you're bringing on a new child, new member. That baby doesn't even know, but it's a member of this hoopball community now, whether it likes it or not. But before we take off, I mean, this was pretty much a quick hitter show, 30-minute show. We'll just spend a couple minutes. I know you have a few things written down just over the past couple of weeks. We're not going to go over every single detail. As we start breaking down the teams, a lot of this will probably come a little bit more to the forefront. But is there anything that stands out as just some important news that you took away that might be useful once DFS NBA kicks back off?
Absolutely, Mike. I think so. There's been a few rumblings. I think one of the big kind of injury-related news, the most, I guess, recent one, I would say, from just kind of a guys that are recovering from injury. So there's been a few guys that, when we hit pause on the season, there's been a couple guys that there were question marks in terms of when they will play again this year. So there's been some additional rumblings around guys like Blake Griffin, potentially of the Pistons coming back. He's claiming that he's fully healthy, so that should be interesting. To something to monitor based on kind of whether he's going to get any minutes at all, if and when the season does restart. So that could be interesting. I thought that was pretty exciting. Also, the kind of injury recovery, I've been following a lot of Jusuf Nurkic. That's very interesting as well, given how well of a fantasy monster Hassan Whiteside has been this year. For anyone that's been able to build lineups with him, it's going to be interesting to see kind of the time allotment between those two, that position battle. So that should be fun to watch as well, from my perspective.
And so let's talk about the Blake Griffin news. How would you expect that to affect us in DFS necessarily? Because obviously the impact it would have would be drastic. We're talking about a guy who absorbs a ton of usage. Could see significant, change in his stats alone with now Andre Drummond playing over there in Cleveland. But who would that affect, and on the floor, and what kind of price tag? I know I'm throwing a loaded question at you because it's kind of hard to gauge that. Would you be comfortable with paying for Blake Griffin coming back with no Andre Drummond if he were healthy?
I would say, I mean, if we're looking at just Blake Griffin having just health on his side, that's a clear-cut example of a GPP play for sure versus a cash game play, because there's so many factors, there's so many question marks there in terms of his playing time, his game shape, how many minutes they're going to try and run him out there. But in terms of who he's going to affect the most, I think there's no question about the development we've seen in the past month, about 6 weeks even, of Christian Wood, who's really come into his own for the Pistons. So that could be a huge kind of deterrence from a usage perspective, and that could really affect his potential as the season resumes. And then from a pricing standpoint, that's a real tough one, Mike, I have to say. I would say his price could be anywhere between 6,000 all the way up to 8,000 even, depending on how egregious they want to price him out when he comes back.
Yeah, and I knew that was kind of a loaded. I was hoping for some sort of range. If you came out and said he's gonna be 7,200, and I was gonna write 7,200 and circle it, and then when this all ended, just look back at it, and if you were right, I was gonna ask you for the lotto numbers. It was gonna be that simple. That was the plan. But yeah, no, I think you you're absolutely right. I think Christian Wood be the guy clearly affected the most, just because he's simply, the diamond in the rough. I've been a big Christian Wood guy for some time now, and he's a high ceiling, pretty high floor guy that can be used in cash games and tournaments, and he's probably the best DFS and fantasy option on the Pistons right now. So, if he's clearly going to be affected, that's something we have to take into account, and it's going to be his salary possibly being too high right when we come out of the gate, because it's not taking into account that Blake Griffin's going to be playing next to him. And it could be that Blake's is too low, because he might be priced as though, Andre Drummond was still on the floor, because a lot of their numbers that they'll be using for their algorithms will be based on, how healthy is he. So it's going to be in his minutes. We can't expect a guy like that to probably play a boatload of minutes for a non-competitive team right now. But if he were to come out and play big minutes, he'd probably be underpriced because of the minutes, and he'd probably be underpriced because Andre Drummond was eating rebounds alongside of him since they've been there. So I would be okay with paying. If he's playing 35 minutes, let's say, I'd be okay with paying that $8,000 without Andre Drummond there. I doubt we end up seeing a guy like that play that many minutes when we get back in there, or if he plays at all. But probably going to be a little bit underpriced. Definitely GPP though, because there's so much risk involved. The ceiling's high, but the floor's high, but the ceiling is pretty low as well. We've seen some pretty big duds out of Blake, and the injury risk involved as well. Another big, tidbit that just popped out is Bojan Bogdanovic for the Jazz had to undergo some wrist surgery. So he was dealing with discomfort for most of the season, kind of played through it. It went away during his little layoff during COVID while he was home. It kind of popped back up. He got checked out. And, the team and Bogdanovic opted that it would probably be wise to just get the surgery now. They have him on a 4-year-long deal rather than this be a problem down the road. At this point, no one's completely sure if they do have a season, when it will come back, or what's going on with it. So I think all just kind of ran into that decision where let's get the surgery now. But, that's another thing that we're going to have to keep in mind once we get back in there. And, who are the players you expect to kind of take advantage of with Bogdanovic now sidelined? I guess who's going to get a little bit of increase in usage and such things. And then, that'll bring us into, which guy do you think would be the chalkier play for DFS?
Yeah, that's a great point. And if I may, I think it's astounding that Bojan Bogdanovic was able to have. He was having kind of a career year when this all went down, and he was able to play through this injury for so many months on his shooting hand. So that's commendable. Just to put that out there as well. Pretty impressive stuff. But I would say from a chalkier play, without a doubt, Donovan Mitchell is a huge benefactor here because he was already the lead dog from the Jazz side in terms of just his play and his fantasy potential. From a daily fantasy potential, he's been averaging the most DFS points of anyone. Rudy Gobert, I don't think will be as effective with this injury news. Another guy that might end up being a little more chalky, a guy that was really rounding into form as the season was went into pause, was Mike Conley Jr. He was another guy that kind of a forgotten DFS player for most of the year, really priced down, but really started to come on a little bit towards the end there. So that's a couple guys to look at.
See, and that just shows how different some people think. Because I actually, when you said Mike Conley, that popped in my head, and I think that would be the less chalky play. I think a lot of people would probably gravitate more towards Mitchell. Even Joe Ingles, I think, is a big beneficiary to this now because he's probably going to go back to either playing the 3 or the 4. I think Royce O'Neal would obviously see some more minutes. He's one of those guys that would make sense in cash because not necessarily a super high ceiling, but minutes equal money. And if he's dirt cheap playing 35 minutes, he's most likely going to have a decent enough floor where we're not too worried about him. Getting 40 or 50 DK points. We'll take the 20 or 25 from him for less than 4K or 4K-ish. So Mike Conley actually stood out to me as a player that I kind of have some interest with just because he's been burning everybody all season long. You touched on it. I don't think Gobert would be a big beneficiary, just simply because Bogdanovich purely is a scorer. If I remember correctly, he had a stat line this season. I believe it was like 34 actual points with 0 points or 0 rebounds, 0 assists, 0 steals, 0 blocks, nothing else. Here's strictly points. So you're going to be looking for the guys that are going to have to take on some more of a scoring load. They'll see their usage increase. I think Conley, you hit the nail on the head, will probably see something, but I think he would stand out as the guy that burned everybody earlier and was like the Utah bust. While Mitchell, Ingles, and even Royce O'Neal would probably be everybody's first go-to options. I don't. Am I just speaking that into existence?
No,
do you think? Or?
Honestly, I mean, you bring up a good point. When I meant Mike Conley, I meant more the fact that I think that he's certainly a guy to look at if you wanna build your lineup. A guy maybe more of a potential GPP play in the beginning, but could potentially become more of a cash game play. But to your point, he has burned so many people throughout the year that it's certainly a risk, and it's fair to call him far from a chalky option.
No, and I wasn't saying it in a way of like you're wrong. No. I mean it's a great thing to talk about, and we almost have to speak about these things because the first three names, the ones that pop into your head, are generally going to tend to be the ones that are a little bit chalky. And it's not always chalky for everybody. So you think of it in the mindset, I'm sure of. You don't, and it's a good mindset to have. You don't let somebody what they did for you yesterday affect what they're going to do for you today. You don't look at it from that angle. You take each day as a new one as a whole, where you don't let the bridges burn necessarily impact your decision making when you're playing a guy, which I think is extremely important. I don't think a lot of people have that same capability, and that's kind of why when I look at Mike Conley, I kind of look at him from the same lens as you. I still think he's extremely talented. I think he has a lot of good games, and I think maybe this time off is only going to be helpful for a guy like him that is generally nursing a few soreness injuries, kind of thing. But let's hope, man. If we get a cheap Mike Conley and he's low owned, I think that's good for both of us. But we'll just touch on a few other things, and we'll take off out of here. Joel Embiid, Brett Brown kind of came out and said that when playoffs do begin, he's expecting Joel Embiid to play 38 minutes a night. That stands out to me as something that's huge simply because he is a point per minute monster. Giving him 38 minutes a night in the East is, pretty much every team he'll go against besides Toronto struggles with rebounding. Should be able to have their way with all those other centers. The fact that Ben Simmons is still pretty much hurt. They said that he's getting some on-court, workouts in and everything like that. But basically, if things were to start tomorrow, he probably wouldn't be ready. So I think Embiid, they're pretty much looking to shoulder a lot of this playoff potential work once this does kick back off. So something I thought was worth noting, maybe you have a little star next to him. It's worth keeping an eye on. And the Nets came out and said Kevin Durant would not be playing if the season were to continue. Regardless, which I don't know your take on that, Dave. It doesn't make much sense to me. I think if he could play, like if he actually is healthy enough to play, and they have Kyrie Irving healthy enough to play, and the Nets are in the playoffs, why not play? I don't know. What's your feeling on that?
Yeah, it's certainly a tricky, sticky situation on the Nets side and Kevin Durant's side. I mean, he's looking at his future and kind of where kind of the team is headed and kind of the potential there. Even for as soon as next year, and given this season is potentially going to be shortened to a point where we still don't know in terms of from a Kyrie side, is Kyrie coming back? And if they're both healthy, I mean, to your point, and they're in the playoff picture, they have a legitimate chance as any other team to really make a run at it, and he can provide some fantasy, some daily fantasy gold potentially if he is healthy enough to play. But given just what we've seen in the past with Kevin Durant, I feel like there's, based on what happened in Golden State especially, I feel like he's going to definitely be more cautious this time around versus the last time.
Yeah, I think that's exactly what it comes down to. And I don't blame him for being cautious. I think they weren't expecting to have him at all this season, so it wasn't even a thought in their mind. So it's not even worth or you need to really necessarily entertain it going forward. But it would be cool. I would love to see them kind of come in. I mean, realistically, they're going to have a very similar team that they have right now as opposed to next year, even probably with a few less guys. Joe Harris, I don't know if they'll be able to keep him retained when he's expected to hit free agency. And so I think that they'd have a very good chance to kind of come out with both those guys healthy. But that's a big key factor. And, to Kevin Durant. It seems like to me it would be another Astros championship, and that's kind of like Kevin Durant's saying. He loves having those championships that people are gonna wonder, did he deserve or did he earn? So this would just be another opportunity to throw one more up, but. That's all we have for you guys. We're gonna wrap it up over here. We do appreciate you guys listening. So if you have a chance, please go on iTunes, give us a 5-star rating if you could. Anywhere you can listen to this podcast, you can find it on iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher, Podbean, iHeartRadio. All over the place, guys. So we really do appreciate it. It allows us to continue knowing what we're doing right and then improving on what you guys think that you'd rather hear or what you like better. So we're just always trying to make sure that we're hitting on all the good points and making this entertaining for you guys. So let us know what you think and give us some positive, constructive feedback. So is there anything else you'd like to say, Dave, before we take off out of here?
No, I think one thing I wanted to just close out with is just hoping for everyone to continue to stay healthy and get excited for this NBA season if and when it does resume, and just excited to see some live sports again. That's going to be great.
Absolutely, brother, and it's a when, not if. We got the positive mentality. I need basketball, man, so I gotta say when the NBA returns. But I had a great time doing the show with you. I'm looking forward to the next one. I think you'll probably be on with Andrew next, but we're gonna be pumping out some shows early and more often than we have been. This was just kind of my off season. I was taking the time to get the body and the mind right and heal up from those mid-season nagging injuries I've been dealing with. So we'll be back soon enough, guys. Next show we'll be breaking down some GPP strategy, and then we will start transitioning into some team breakdowns and what we're expecting once this season does kick back off. So from everybody over here at Hoopball, from me, from Dave, stay safe, take care, and have yourselves a good day.
This has been a Hoop Ball presentation.